Good day to my students in historiography. This PowerPoint is a brief introduction to some of the revisionist trends in the history of slavery. This is an important topic in and of itself, but it's also a good background as you begin reading Horton and Horton's book on slavery and public history. Several years ago, I attended a seminar at Columbia University on the teaching about the history of slavery, and James Horton was one of the presenters at that. David Blight, who teaches at Yale, was the other one. James Horton teaches at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. The early traditional views of history were greatly shaped by a historian named Ulrich Bonnell Phillips. I've put a paper on my UJ in the section under lecture texts that you should read. It is from the Georgia Encyclopedia about Phillips. Phillips was a Southerner born in Georgia, born during the Reconstruction era. He studied at Columbia under William A. Dunning and received a doctorate from Columbia in 1902. One of his most important books was American Negro Slavery, and another important book he wrote about 11 years later, Life and Labor in the Old South. Phillips bounced around like a lot of scholars do in the beginning of their teaching career, but eventually he was hired by the University of Michigan, spent 18 years there, trained a lot of PhD students who meant that his ideas were carried on then by other teachers. In 1929, he was hired by Yale University, but he died about 4 years later. But his views of slavery were widely adopted in the standard view in American history books. An important book, this is a book we used at that seminar that I mentioned earlier, Peter Parrish, Slavery, History, and Historians. It's a survey of how historians have looked at slavery. It was published in 1989, so it's a little out of date now, but it's still a very important book. This is what he said about Phillips. He said, Phillips treated the slave as a beneficiary of a patriarchal but unprofitable institution designed to maintain the South's cardinal principle of white supremacy. And then he goes on and remarks about how this conventional interpretation lasted for about 30 years. Now, it's not so relevant to the study of slavery, but William Dunning, that Phillips studied under, he also produced a standard view of history, the history of Reconstruction, that was the standard view in American history textbooks for probably about 30 or 40 years, was based on Dunning. And it was also based on a lot of negative stereotypes of African Americans. He saw them as people not really interested so much in politics and manipulated by white carpetbaggers. Now, some of the earliest revisionist work was done by Kenneth Stamp. His book, The Peculiar Institution, Slavery in the Antebellum South, was published in 1956. This is the cover of that book. Notice the outrageous price of this book in 1956, $1.95. Again, this is what Peter Parrish says about Stamp. He says that Stamp completely overturned Phillips' conclusions. Stamp saw the slave as a maltreated victim of a profitable economic system. In a nutshell, where Phillips had viewed slavery as mild but inefficient, Stamp saw it as harsh and profitable. Now, whether slavery was profitable is still debated among economic historians, but the general trend today is that yes, it was profitable. It was not likely to have died out if the Civil War had not come along when it did, at least not died out very soon. Now, I have noticed, though, that students often feel that masters just were raking in the money from slaves, but actually When historians say it was economically efficient, they mean it competed with other sources of revenue. If you had a certain amount of money to invest, could you do better investing in industrial stocks or railroads, or if you were in the South, in investing in slave agriculture? And the answer is you could do about as the same. Now, Eugene Genovese is another revisionist historian. Genovese has an interesting history himself, but his book, Roll, Jordan, Roll, The World the Slaves Made, was one of the most important books on the everyday life and work of slaves, the slave community, the role of religion in the slaves' lives, and how slaves tried to resist the oppression of slavery, something that is called agency that I'll discuss more in a moment here. Genovese was an Italian American. As a young scholar, he embraced Marxism and wrote with a clear Marxist slant. But as you've heard me say in classes before, probably the old saying, any man who's not a communist by the time he's 20 is a fool. If he's not over it by the time he's 30, he's a damn fool. Well, like many people, Genovese became more conservative as he grew older, turned against Marxism, and became more politically conservative, but also re-embraced his family's Roman Catholic roots and became more religiously conservative. I mentioned a moment ago this idea of agency. Now, I have put a quiz on my UJ. This is a quiz that you can just do and send back to me by email. But I want you to do some internet research and come up with a definition of agency. But historians talk about the concept of agency when dealing with people that were in an oppressed situation. So, for example, with slaves, even though these people were oppressed, did they have any ability to shape their lives as they wished, even if this shaping was in a very limited way? Some of you had US 2 1865 with me, and you may remember in the Hollis Reader there was an essay by Drew Gilpin Faust about slaves on a rice plantation in South Carolina. I don't believe she ever used the term agency in that essay, but she was talking about this topic precisely. A problem with the concept of agency is if you stress it too much, it can come across as, well, these people were kind of free moral agents shaping their own life. Well, were they really oppressed then? I had a student years ago that probably was somewhat racist, and after reading that essay by Faust, he thought, boy, now we've got the truth. Slavery really wasn't all that oppressive. These slaves were just kind of running the plantation. As with many things in scholarship and in life in general, it's probably best to find a reasonable balance. Slaves were oppressed, but they did find ways to resist, at least in some ways, the total domination of their circumstances. As traditional as U.B. Phillips was, he talked about slavery as a labor system shaped by mutual requirements, concessions, and understandings, producing reciprocal codes of conventional morality and responsibility. Now, you would assume the concessions would be made by the masters since they're the ones with power. If there were concessions from the masters and reciprocal codes of conventional morality, then there was agency there in some sense. Now, a major part of the revision of slavery has rested on evidence from the slaves themselves. We often think that people like American Indians or slaves who were not literate in English may not have left many records, but they left many more records than we might think. Abolitionists, of course, before the Civil War, used the testimony of runaway slaves, these narratives of how they had been treated. Now, these are valuable, but in the last 20 or 30 years, historians have started to recognize that you cannot assume these are a very clear understanding of slavery. Obviously, the abolitionists were not interested in providing an objective, balanced account of slavery. They were looking for things that showed it at its very worst. An important project on slave narratives was the Federal Slave Narrative Project, sometimes called the WPA Slave Narrative Collection. During the Depression, under New Deal programs, the Work Projects Administration set up the Federal Writers Project. They were trying to create jobs for people like writers and historians who really don't have any marketable skills, of course. You might remember from the video on Angie Debo that she wrote a book on Oklahoma for the Federal Writers Project, but it was so heavily edited when they got done with it that it hardly reflected her work. But from 1936 to 1938, the people employed by the Federal Writers Project interviewed former slaves, which of course there were very few by that time, but also the children of slaves, to find out what their parents had said about their experiences. And as I've mentioned in class many times, in many classes, surprisingly enough, they found out slaves did not like slavery. Frederick Douglass was a runaway slave and prominent abolitionist. His autobiography is an important slave narrative. Douglass made an interesting comment about the better slaves are treated, the more they want to be free. You can read the quote there yourself. But this is the interesting thing. You would think that the worst treated slaves would want freedom more. But people who are treated a little better start to think, I not only deserve to be treated well, I deserve to be free. Hughes and Kane, in their book on American economic history, tell this story. I'm just going to let you read that comment on your own, and you've probably heard me talk about it in classes anyway. I posted on my UJ a couple of weeks ago an article that I recently wrote for a literary reference collection about Solomon Northup. He is an interesting character because he was born free. His father had been a slave, but set free in his master's will. Solomon Northup was free, but he was kidnapped and sold into slavery. After 12 years, he was rescued and published his account of his life as a slave. Theodore Dwight Weld was an abolitionist who, along with his wife and her sister, Weld was married to Angelina Grimke, and her sister, Sarah Grimke. These three people together put together an important collection of primary sources that was named American Slavery as It Is, or sometimes you see the title as just Slavery as It Is. The subtitle of this book is very important, The Testimony of 1,000 Witnesses, because the witnesses were slaveholders or other people in the South unwittingly giving proof of how cruel slavery was. Southerners often defended slavery as being paternalistic, of course, but the truth was it was very cruel. So some examples of this that are found in this book, sale ads stating that families would be divided if necessary, runaway ads describing brandings on the slave, even on the face, cuts and scars from whipping. All of these things would be useful in identifying the runaway. Also ads where the master says he will pay you a certain amount if you will give the slave 50 lashes or something like this before you return it. Now, most of you have heard of Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. As one English professor wrote a few years back, I finally realized I have to stop telling the class, well, you read this in high school. No, you were assigned it, but you didn't read it. Uncle Tom's Cabin was published in 1852. It sold 300,000 copies in the first year of its publication. Remember, this is at a time when the United States population was around 30 million. So this would be equivalent of about 3 million copies being sold in a year today. It is a novel, of course, but it's important because it did bring the day-to-day life of slaves home to people in the North. Stowe also emphasized that slavery brutalizes the whites as well as the black slaves. Obviously, the slaves were brutalized, but living with slavery and being in the position of a master often made people more accepting of cruelty. There are strong religious and moral themes in the book as well.